I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Karen Hooker today. Dr. Hooker is professor and co-director of the School of Social and Behavioral Health Sciences at Oregon State University. She is the founder of the Center for Healthy Aging Research at Oregon State University and is the inaugural Jo Ann Leonard Endowed Director of the center. She received her PhD from She received her PhD in Human Development and Family Studies from Pennsylvania State University and held appointments at Duke University and Syracuse University. Memberships include the Gerontological Society of America and the Division 20 Adult Development and Aging of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Hooker was the recipient of the Association of Gerontology in Higher Education Distinguished Faculty Award in 2010 and won the CALC Innovation Publication Award from GSA in 2005. She has been a scientific reviewer for the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation and has served as an associate editor of the Journal of Gerontology Psychological Sciences. She's currently leading an NSF-funded integrative graduate education and research traineeship program in aging sciences and is the first program to have aging as the focus. Her research focuses on the role of the personality system and understanding health and social relationships with methodological emphasis on process-oriented micro-longitudinal approaches. And just for fun, Dr. Hooker enjoys kayaking and exercising her vocal cords as part of a women's singing group and loves to spend her non-researching hours with her spouse and 2 sons. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hooker.
Okay, I wanted, first of all, to say thanks again for inviting me to be here, part of this symposium. I just think it's I've heard about it for years, and I think it's such a great idea, and not only hopefully will people in the audience learn from us, but I am really learning from the other presenters as well today, so we really appreciate that. And I also want to say thanks to Karis for coming and getting me at the airport so late last night. I know you have that was really sweet of you, I appreciate it. Okay, so a very brief overview here is that I'm going to talk a little bit really more about the personality system and how it may play a role in influencing our social and health behaviors in later life, and talk a little bit especially about something that I think really underlies health behaviors, and that is goal pursuit. How do we go about pursuing our goals? How do our goals help make us who we are, and then how do we pursue them? So now for something completely different, I am going to take an intra-individual variability approach to this. And of course, the projects all do have to have cute little names. So my project is called the Pulse Project. And then I'll end with talking a little bit about future directions. Okay, so just some brief acknowledgments to my collaborators. On top are my students, some IGERT students, and on the bottom is the Pulse team. And this has been funded by supporting students from NSF as well as the Center for Healthy Aging Research. And I also wanted to acknowledge my student Shannon Mejia, a doctoral student who was very centrally involved in these studies that I'm going to talk about today, and especially the analytic approaches. Okay, so I thought I'd start to talk a little bit about personality and aging. And if you think about it, much of what we really know about optimal aging is focused on the lifelong importance of health-related behaviors such as exercise, not smoking, eating in moderation, drinking in moderation if at all, being actively engaged in life, and having a really strong social network. And other known predictors of what makes for good health span are things like education levels, socioeconomic status, and social structural variables, serving as kind of risk factors. Some other variables are gender and race, but surprisingly little really is known about the person in whom these risk factors cohere. And in fact, I would argue that personality is really the driving force behind many antecedents of successful aging, except, of course, those structural variables. So, what type of person you are? How reliably can you be counted on? Your approach to people. All of these are really centrally involved in how we approach our health, how we approach our social relationships, and our health span. So, I think part of the reason why personality hasn't been really looked at that much is that it wasn't until recently seen as a construct that was open for It was seen as too rigidly stable, and it wasn't really seen as open for intervention. However, we know from more recent work that personality, in fact, can change throughout the lifespan, and the good news is, for those interested in adult development and aging, is that personality, the trait part of personalities anyway, does seem to, if there's going to be some developmental trajectories, be more positive ones, so more towards maturity, maybe a little less hostility and neuroticism and more conscientiousness. So that's another good news, I think. So several years ago, I sort of built on Dan McAdams and his tri-level personality. He talked about traits, he talked about personal action constructs, and life story as kind of the structural aspects of personality. And I found this very compelling at the time because the field was really going back and forth between, is personality stable? Does it change? If it changes, what predicts the change? But what I thought was really missing in all that still was the process components of personality. So along with traits, we have states. People aren't the same every day. Along with personal action constructs, which are our goals, and can change, but maybe not all that quickly, our self-regulation. How do we go about meeting our goals? And then along with the life story is, of course, self-narration. How you tell the story about your life, who do you tell it to, and we know, for example, from some of Cynthia Adams' work that it changes depending on the context and the audience. So today, this is the personality system writ large, okay? It's really much broader than we typically give it credit for. It's more than just traits. Today I'm going to talk mainly about the level 2 personality, the personal action constructs, and self-regulation. Okay. So I thought I was just so happy when Diana Nyad made her swim from Cuba to Florida. I was so thrilled for her. I'm a swimmer. But also I thought, what a great example of goal-focused goal pursuit. We do know that over the last 50 years or so that to a large extent development is guided by our own pursuits, our own goals, our intentions, goals, motivations, and of course our behaviors as well. So we know development's multi-directional, multi-dimensional, and in fact we are producers of our own development. So Diana Nyad's example I think is a great one. Here's somebody who, talk about tenacious goal pursuit, right? She tried 5 times. The first time in her 20s, I think when she was 29. And then she didn't try again until her 60s. But here she is at 64 doing this momentous task that was very much, it was her striving that caused it to happen. But in addition to building her mental strength as well as her physical strength and endurance, she also built a team of supporters that could support her efforts. Engineers she had to build her specialized suit. She had medical personnel on the boat to tell her if she could keep going. But also importantly, yes, development is to some extent under our control, but there's certainly things outside our control as well, and this is another good example. For example, the Gulf Stream helped her make this swim this time. Previously, the current had sort of taken her out, as well as the fact that there were not as many jellyfish in the water. And of course, she had this specialized suit. The point is she adapted to her context, learned goal strategies to make this historical milestone happen, which was indeed very important for her own life story. Okay, so how we reach our goals is partly due to individual agency, but also very heavily also dependent on social context. But what I want to argue is that our social context doesn't just happen to us, but it's something that over time we really create. I don't know if any of you remember back to Scar and McCartney's articles about niche picking. So for example, over time, we may end up in social networks that look entirely different from the circumstances we grew up in due to niche picking our social context and so forth. Now we all know, everybody in this room knows, there's abundant data on how very important social support is for all aspects of our health. And I think many people in this room really have research agendas addressing the mechanisms driving this complex relationship. So I also just want to argue it's important to reflect on the extent to which there are bidirectional relationships between who we are and the social networks that we create. And a somewhat underappreciated factor is personality. So what are these social support networks that we create? Well, I want to talk a little bit about the social convoy model, because I'm going to talk about it later in terms of our research study. But Kahn and Antonucci, as many of you know in this room, created the convoy model to describe how social relationships travel with individuals throughout the lifespan and life course. Okay, and their particular model, it was a hierarchical model where those in the center circle are those who are very close to us, you couldn't live without them. Those in the next layer out are people who are very important, but perhaps not quite as close. And then the outer circle are people that, yes, they're in our lives, we consider them part of our social network, but maybe we don't see them daily, or for whatever reason don't consider them to be quite as important. Sorry about that. Let me go up. Go back. Yes, this is what I want. I'm sorry. Come on, technology. Okay, how do I make this? You're going to be sick of seeing these slides when I'm done here. I'm going to go to escape. Yeah. And then say from current slide. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Okay, so importantly, I think convoys are very heterogeneous, right? They vary certainly in size. Some people have very well-developed convoys, others less so. They vary in terms of composition. Are these mainly family members in the convoy? Are they a mixture of family and friends? Or some people really have convoys that are primarily made up of friendships. So that's an important thing to know and look at. Another point is that convoys themselves are very fluid. I did not touch a thing there, I promise. And so understanding more about how aspects of the individual shape the convoy and are reciprocally shaped by the individual is really important for the investigation. And I want to set the stage for how our research team is addressing this, and so I'm going back to Ray Cattell's data box. How many of you remember this? Maybe some of you in the room do. But basically, Raymond Cattell was a personality psychologist who said that basically for every act, there's a person who does it, there's a variable that defines it, or variables, and an occasion that locates it in time. And what I want to argue about today is that for the most part, most of our research, we've paid almost exclusive attention to sampling people. And there's some other sampling strategies that we can take that might also give us some interesting new information. Okay, so I would say that the vast majority studies in HDFS, psychology, sociology, public health, really all the social sciences, take this inner individual data slice, which looks at many people, many persons, usually now many variables, but a lot of times only on a single occasion. Or, increasingly, a longitudinal study would do this several times at widely spaced intervals, maybe 6 months, a year, 2 years, or whatever, so that what the study can really address is mean level changes for the group, okay? That's what it addresses. Intra-individual data, on the other hand, takes this slice of the matrix in which for one individual, you have lots of variables and lots of occasions, okay? And these occasions can be over many days, sometimes over many times within a day. Those of you who know about experience sampling methods, where people are beeped throughout the day and then report on their feelings and maybe physiological data and so forth. And then seeing how variables are associated with one another for that particular individual over time. And I think this can be quite instructive if we're really interested in understanding how to change health behaviors, how to motivate individual people, because health behaviors, health decisions, support networks, all of these things can be captured at the behavioral signature level of the individual. Now, we need to then, one might argue, is take many of those studies, almost single case studies, group them together, And so then you can get like an idiothetic approach, which is a combination of idiographic, which is focused on the individual, with nomothetic. The nomothetic science is science in general, and then the idiothetic is the combining of those so that you can parse out the individual, but still basically see themes of uniformity across lives, but that still have clarity at the individual level. Okay. When doing this, when we take an idiographic or idiothetic approach and measure people on lots of occasions, we discover some interesting new ways in which people really do differ from one another. For example, people have different ranges of plasticity or variability on variables. The person on the left, for example, maybe that's self-efficacy, and that person's swinging wildly from one day to the next, okay? The person on the right you would characterize perhaps as much more stable, correct? So basically then, the extent to which someone varies on a variable can become almost a trait-like characteristic for that person, something that can be looked at. So people can be described in terms of their behavioral signature of how widely they do vary. And for example, this can be called a dynamic characteristic, where you just get, for example, the intra-individual standard deviation is an example of a dynamic characteristic. You can see for this individual whether they tend to vary a lot or tend to vary not so much. So it's like a range of plasticity, if you will, for that person. We can also look at dynamic processes, which can look at the time structuring of the variability. Are there trends over time? Is there a cyclical pattern to the trends? For example, moods might get better on weekends, but then maybe fluctuate down a bit on Mondays, I don't know. This type of change, for example, would not really be considered development, however. So to characterize something as true developmental change, we need lots of data points to be able to see trends that might be developmental. So an example I'll give here is, let's say your mother just moved into an assisted living facility. And she moved near you, and so you're the one helping her find this assisted living facility, and you find it. And you're very interested in psychological well-being, and so you sort of get a sense of where she is at baseline when she enters the facility at 6 months and maybe 12 months later. Now, you see her every day, but these dots are your brother who's flown in from San Francisco to see her 3 times a year. He sees these and he goes, "Oh my God, this is a terrible place. Look at mom's psychological well-being." Another possibility would be somebody who, on the face of it, looks very stable. That same brother comes, sees the same, she seems to be doing the same on the 3 times he happens to be there, and thinks, wow, pretty stable, that's cool. However, if you, the daughter, are there more often and actually see how she is, look at this. If you draw that line on top, it just so happened that you caught her at the high end when she first moved in, at the middle, halfway through, and at a very low end at 12 months. But actually, if you're following that variability, it's very stable over that time. And again, similarly, maybe the one who looks stable isn't really so stable after all if you take a more micro-longitudinal approach and see that indeed there is a lot of variability. However, there is this disturbing downward trend. So that's kind of the rationale about why we need to maybe, for some studies, I'm not arguing every study has to be this way, but an interesting alternative way to do some studies is to measure people many, many times over lots of days to really try to get a handle on their variability. And Neelam Ram and Dennis Gerstorff wrote a very interesting paper about this that was published in Psychology and Aging a few years ago. And they really talk about trying to parse out intra-individual variability from intra-individual change. If you want to see long-term trajectories of change, the argument might be that you can do these little bursts and get a handle on the variability, and then over time, linking it up to longer longitudinal data sets would be ideal. And they talk about this in terms of macro time, maybe over years or perhaps even decades. We have studies certainly that go decades. And micro time over very short periods of time. So the work I'm going to be talking about today is really on the micro time scale. It's over days. And I'm going to call it a micro-longitudinal study, which I was telling Alex earlier today. I prefer that term over daily diary studies. And maybe it's just because when I was like a girl, I used to keep a diary. It was locked, and I'd write. And so that's not what I'm talking about. Okay, so the two things I'm going to talk about really are micro-longitudinal studies of health and social goals, health and social goal processes. So the self-regulation of goals involves goal setting, goal pursuit, and goal accomplishment. And a lot of previous research has shown that health goals and social goals are extremely important to older adults. Working towards a health goal we know can help people support positive health behaviors such as proper nutrition, daily exercise. Building social support networks is also extremely important for their health. So anyway, the basic questions I'm looking at is how do people go about doing this? How do they approach their health and social goals? So I'm calling this, by looking at health and social goals that they themselves pick and then seeing how they work towards it, this is a way of looking at self-regulation. And self-regulation is broadly defined as the deliberate attempt to manage actions to facilitate positive adaptation. Okay? So, our PULSE team, Personal Understanding of Life and Social Experiences, it's an interdisciplinary one. Me and two of my students who are social scientists, as well as two software engineers, computer scientists. And anyway, we needed a customized platform to assess people daily for a significant portion of a year. In looking at health behaviors, if you're trying to look at people who are setting a goal and working towards it, we know from research in health research that it takes at least 3 months to establish a positive health behavior or to make a new change. So we knew we wanted it to be for more than 3 months, and so we thought 100 days would be good. But how do you actually do this? So to our knowledge, so we partnered with these two engineers who were wonderful to work with, and to our knowledge, this is the first micro-longitudinal study of older adults that has been conducted entirely over the internet. And because it is, and because it might be kind of hard to maybe think about, well, what do people do? I do have a fair number of slides showing this, so bear with me. Okay, so the goals of PULSE were to capture processes of self-regulation over 100 days, in the studying regulation in the context of their daily life. So we collected a lot of information on a lot of variables over those 100 days. So I'll show you more in a minute. And we also wanted to be able to identify individual characteristics related to distinct patterns of these social regulatory processes. And the engineers we worked with were also very interested in data visualization. That was their specialty, data viz. And in talking with them, it became very clear to me that this could be a really cool way in terms of health engagement is a big thing now with health plans. I don't know if some of you have to, when you sign up for your health plan now, you have to take this health engagement thing and you have to do all these things online. But we thought, wow, if you could engage people in data visualization of their own data, maybe that would keep them interested in doing it for 100 days. And in a way, I think we found that there were some interesting effects because of that. So the basic design was that people took an initial survey, which was fairly long, but in that initial survey, they formed a health goal and a social goal that then populated their daily surveys, okay? But it was specific to them. So people could have, we wanted the goals to be meaningful for the person. And then there were these daily surveys, and we were also interested in a methodological question about how much data do you really need to be able to get the behavioral signature. So we had what we called the burst group, which the measurements were over 100 days, but instead of 100 days end on end, it was 4 periods of 7 days, okay, so 28 days altogether. Then we had a post-survey where we got some project feedback. Okay. Okay, so this is just a little bit more information about it. So the initial survey was, we recruited from the Life Registry, which is Unabashedly, this is a convenient sample of people who are in the Life Registry, which is a registry in Oregon of adults over the age of 50, who, as part of our Center for Healthy Aging Research, have given us just really their contact information and have said to us, if you have any studies, we'd be interested in knowing about it. So currently there's about 600 people in that Life Registry, and it's people from all over the state. So we sent out an email invitation to participate in this research. And 105 responded that, it sounds interesting, I'd like to get involved. And actually did the initial survey, which was pretty time intensive. After that, 5 did drop out, and 1 we ended up dropping because their data was too spotty. They didn't participate in more than, I think, 8 days, so we dropped them. We found there were no statistical differences in terms of a lot of things you can look at demographically and so forth between those that were dropped and those that were retained. The micro-longitudinal phase, then, we ended up with 99 people who then got randomly assigned into the daily group, so there were 76 people there, or the burst group, 23 people there. And there were no differences between those groups on lots of different variables that we looked at. Okay, so here's the participant workflow. We invited them in, welcome, they did the sign-in, IRB consent, and then they got the initial survey, which I'll tell you about more in a minute. And and between IRB and the initial survey, we did the random assignment into burst versus daily. Okay, so then we could remind them to do the survey, and then the next steps, in that initial survey where they were having to give us some data, one kind of cool thing about doing this over the internet is that you can actually look at the data as it's coming in and determine whether or not they're kind of getting what you're asking them to do. So for example, we had them do a social convoy measure, and one woman, for example, in her convoy, she put her dog, and as much as we would have loved to have kept that in there, I'm sure maybe the dog is very supportive for her. We felt that probably we asked her to put somebody else in instead of the dog. But you can do that kind of a thing. So then people received an email each morning with a link to their survey and asked to complete it in the evening. And the link itself expired at 2 a.m. So somebody couldn't go in later and do like 10 days in a row. The daily surveys were designed to be completed in 5 minutes. The initial survey was 52, but the daily surveys were much shorter. Okay, so then they get the daily pulse email and the daily data viz, and then this repeats for 100 days or 4 times 7. And we were able to see that because of the timestamp nature of the data, it took people on average 4.6 minutes to do it. So we were able to keep it under 5 minutes. And we were also able to assure that they did complete it at the end of the day. In fact, 83% did complete all of them in the evening. Okay, so the researcher workflow, I don't need to go into this too much, I don't think, except I would like to say that each day the system, it was wonderful having a system that would email us a daily report of the expired sessions, so we could sort of keep a handle on if people were really participating or not. And we followed up with participants who missed 2 days in a row. So we did sort of encourage their ongoing participation. The research did take place in the summer, so for a few people who just said, I'd love to be in the study, but I'm going to, Canada for 2 weeks or something, and I don't know if I'll have internet connection, we were able to pause it for those people. So that was another plus. So the back-end interface, we could see participant profiles, we could see what their goals were, we could see who their social contacts were. And then we could see how they were doing. This is an example of the data visualization people got. So for example, on a scale of optimism, we gave people information on their answer today, so that little triangle is the answer today, as well as their average answer over the days that they had done so far. Okay, so the database obviously built as the study went on, and they could click on different things to find out information. They could hide detail, they could expand it to look more. We considered trying to compare their data to everybody who's in the study, but we decided at the end of that we wouldn't do that because there might be some social comparison. People might get depressed if they saw that they weren't making health goal progress, but everybody else was, even though they were all very individualized goals. Okay, so here were the actual measures that we looked at. So demographic information, the things in orange are variables that then went on to populate the daily surveys. So the personal health goals and social goals. We looked at many different things. The NEO-FFI is a trait measure of personality. We looked at depression, optimism, possible selves, self-perceptions of aging, health behaviors, health perception scale. The social convoy, which I'll show you more in a minute, we did ask people to name the social convoy, everybody in it, but then we took the 5 names that were closest in their inner circle and used these names to populate the daily survey and then generated some more questions about those interactions. Then we also had scales of social engagement and a social support appraisal scale. Yeah, so here's the Antonucci and Kahn kind of social convoy measure. There's just a few statistics up there about how many in general were in the inner circle, the middle circle, and the outer circle. Okay. All right, so let's see where they're, oh, and then these are the daily pulse measures. So these were the 100-day measures. So we got their health and social goal progress, which again are populated individually for everybody, social support and social hindrance, positive and negative affect, stress, optimism, contact with 5 closest social partners, all sorts of things here. So, we asked people also to write down if there were any noteworthy events that day, and so we could maybe go back and look if we saw some trends in the data. All right, so here's how it looked to the participants sitting in their home or whatever on their computer. So rate your progress towards your goal of, and then it would populate whatever the keywords people said that they had on their goals. So yeah, so exercise every day, that would populate every day, and then they rated, I didn't make any progress, I made a lot of progress. And then we use the slider to indicate how well these words describe everything. And note also that there are not numbers on these scales, and we did that purposely because when you're doing things over and over again, we didn't want people to think, oh, well, I usually score an 8 on this, and so just kind of remember that. But the numbers were underlying the database and were captured that obviously we used in the data analysis. The other neat thing about doing it on the computer is that the items were presented in a random order each day within blocks so that there were hopefully no order effects. And so that was another nice feature of doing it this way. Here was our daily measure of contact satisfaction. Okay, so this is micro-longitudinal. So please indicate who you interacted with today. And then all 5 people that they listed as their close-in people were popped up on the screen. So for example, Manuel, yes. How did you contact Manuel? And in person, by phone, social media, text, whatever. How satisfied were you with these interactions? Okay? And then it goes on to the other people. So our daily contact satisfaction measure was actually the sum of the satisfaction over the days divided by the number of people contacted that day. So, okay, here is a sample from our study, and I put in of people sort of tongue-in-cheek here, because yes, it's a convenient sample of only 99 individuals, but it was over 7,032 occasions. And as you can see, this is really a young old sample because the average age was 63. It was mostly female, mostly white, pretty well educated, all those things. So definitely not a representative sample. Okay. And I just want to throw out there the idea about, again, going back to the data box from Cattell and thinking about sampling and sampling frames. Yes, if you're going to sample people, this is very much not a representative sample. And I don't know if these occasions are representative either, but wouldn't it be a nice advance methodologically if we could get a handle on, are these occasions representative for that person or not? So, something to think about. Okay, some evaluation. At the end, one of the things people told us, these are just some quotes. One person said, I think it made me more aware of what I wanted and how I could accomplish that or not by being more intentional. It helped some people make connections across domains. One person said, I realized being social made me content. I had always thought I was a hermit. Also, we realized that some things to improve on would be to make sure we have flexible interfaces and that they all work really well. They did work really well across browsers. There were 4 different browsers people could use, but it seemed like the smartphone interfaces were somewhat of a challenge. And one person said 100 days is a long time, but as tedious as it was, I'll readily admit that recording on a daily basis did help me keep focused on my goals. Okay, so I'm going to sort of quickly walk through a few different studies, and we're working on more, but I thought I would just pick out 3. So the first one is really looking at personality traits related to self-regulation of health and social goals. The second one I want to talk about is really spearheaded by Shannon Mejia, my doctoral student. It was part of her master's thesis, and it's looking at structure, social convoy function and social convoy structure and how these relate to each other. And then the last is dynamic coupling of health and social goals, if I have time. Okay, so going back to that 6 foci model I talked about at the beginning, we did try to look at how traits, we were asking basically the question, could daily self-regulatory processes, which we know are important for architecting our lives on a daily basis really, could these plausibly, could they be related to traits? And could these traits then, could this be one mechanism through which traits have their effects on important life outcomes? Because there's, lots and lots of data of how important traits are for many life outcomes. And then we were also looking at variation in relationship to perceived stress. And the reason we were very interested in perceived stress is that a question we're asking really is, can people stay the course with their goals? And it really depends on these self-regulatory processes. Especially in late life, we think that there might be some added advantage of trying to learn more about how people are able to stay on track. We know stress, which we all have every day to some extent, right? Either more or less. But some of Susan Charles' very interesting work is showing that in later life, adults under stress, it might be a little bit more damaging for them. So and it could potentially throw them more off track. So we argue that this does require an intra-individual research design where relationships between traits, self-regulation, and stress can be examined within individuals over time. Okay, so I'm not going to show you all the tables and everything like that, but I did want to just highlight a few things. So these were our predicted relationships of personality to goal progress. People high in neuroticism, and for some of you in this room, this is maybe going to be a review, but we know people high in neuroticism are prone to stress and negative affect, very self-critical. There's lots of data indicating they have worse health outcomes, poorer health behaviors, and in fact, even earlier deaths. Neuroticism's been linked to mortality. Dan Mratzek's done some very interesting work in this area, who I know you guys all know. We predicted that somebody with high neuroticism would have weaker self-regulatory skills, especially under stress, and make less goal progress on their health goals and their social goals. People who are conscientious are task-oriented, plan ahead, they're persistent, they follow rules. I was surprised, Debbie, when you said that the conscientiousness wasn't related to the advanced life care planning. I would have thought that it would have been. But there's some interesting reasons why it probably wasn't. There's lots of data linking in these long-term longitudinal studies that there's reduced risk of illness, people do more health behaviors, and it's related to longevity. There's quite a bit of data now about that. So we predicted that they would have stronger self-regulatory skills if they were highly conscientious, be less sensitive to stress, and make more goal progress on both of their goals. We looked at extroversion too. People who are highly extroverted are, obviously like being with other people, they're high in warmth, they need a lot of social contact, they tend to be optimistic and have high assertiveness. Some of Alex's work has showed that they're more likely to be engaged in positive events, so there's a lot of good things about being extrovert. So we predicted that they would make more progress on their social goals, because that's such an important domain. But we didn't make any prediction in terms of health goals because we didn't feel we had enough data to really look at that based on the literature. So the study aims here are to determine the extent to which these personality traits explain between-person variation in daily goal process intra-individually in health and social domains. And then within individuals, do effects of traits on self-regulation become more powerful under conditions of daily stress? Okay, so are the results amplified or magnified, if you will, under these conditions? So the analytic strategy, data were analyzed using a series of multi-level random coefficient models. And I won't get into all the gory details around making the data stationary and all that, but it's in the paper if you're interested. Okay. Oh, and we looked at cross-level interactions as well. Okay, so what does it look like when people are talking about their goals? So on the data survey, now remember this was the time one initial survey, we asked people in the text box to describe the goal you expect to be working on for the next 3 to 4 months, and also why is it important to you? We really wanted to get a sense of these are important goals. And then give us a few words that would cue you in the future every day, okay? And then those cue words would populate the daily surveys. Some examples of people's goals were maintaining a healthy weight, increasing body strength, eating more vegetables. And just in the terms here that you can see, some people picked maintenance goals and other people picked achievement goals. In later life, we would predict perhaps that people would have more maintenance goals. We actually did not find that to be the case. A lot of people picked achievement goals, and maybe it's, oh, I didn't see the 10-minute warning. Sorry. Okay, so I am going to fly through these, and here's the perceived stress scale. Just briefly, this is a picture of basically the beta coefficients, so that neuroticism, people had made lower social goal progress, significantly lower, and health goal progress was also lower, but for conscientiousness and extroversion, on the between-person level, we saw positive associations. Okay, so stressful days were associated with lower health goal progress on that day. Stressful days, both health goal progress and social goal progress. Here's an interesting thing. Adding stress to the model activated neuroticism in the health domain, but we found that, interestingly, holding stress constant, if it wasn't a high day, higher levels of neuroticism actually predicted higher health goal progress. Okay, I'm not going to go into this right now. Conscientiousness. But basically I want to tell you that we think this happens, that people high in neuroticism, we may have discovered something, or at least something to follow up on in longer longitudinal studies, is that people high in neuroticism, they may be sort of like an orchid, that under sort of ideal conditions they can thrive and do very well. But that if you pull them out of their ideal days or whatever, then they're not going to do as well, okay? So that's kind of the orchid, an orchid outside the hothouse doesn't thrive. So that's the metaphor there. Okay, those in conscientiousness, very interestingly, when they tended to have much less stress, but if they did have a stressful day, they tended to make lower progress, okay? So interestingly, something that you might not see in a big cross-sectional study is that when they did have a stressful day, it really harmed them more, took them more off track. Okay, so this personality under a microscope does reveal these new findings that I think can only be found in this type of intra-individual micro-longitudinal study. I'm not, unfortunately, I should have started with this study. I'm going to get through the relationship and convoy study, but let me just basically cut to the chase here. We were looking at the convoy, as you saw, and here were our study aims. The structure on goal progress, does having a friend-intensive convoy versus a family-intensive convoy make a difference in how people approach their goals? And the short answer is, having a friend-intensive convoy was positively related to social goal progress. So we were trying to explain this in terms of why friend-intensive, why not family-intensive. And we think that part of the reason is that, friends are help us emotionally maybe, perhaps more than family members, because we choose our friends, we don't choose our family members. But family members, people are very sensitive to their contact with their family members, at least this older adult group was. So that if they have a poor interaction, and so we were able to look at these interactions over 100 days, and if they aren't satisfied with them, it really sort of upsets them more. It upsets the apple cart more, because, they're your family. You're not going to get rid of them. If necessarily, you could change your friends. Okay, so, sorry about the time. I'm not going to have time to talk about the synchronicity of goals, but I will tell you, I'm going to be talking about this at GSA, so come in and hear. So limitations, obviously, of this type of approach, data are all self-report. The sample was very homogeneous, but even given that it was so homogeneous, we saw a lot of variability. And of course, this sample of people was selective in many ways. So where we're going with this in the future is we're going to insert a burst design into a long-term longitudinal study, specifically the UNC Alumni Heart Study. And I think in the future, this is a very interesting way to use some of the data that we can get from sensors, for example, in studying person context interactions. If there's a lot of these smart homes now, or homes where people are putting sensors in. People are wearing sensors that get physiological data, heart rate, respiration, even how fast you walk. Some of the newer ones even have GPSs built into them. As well as, I think, a web-based portal could be an interesting way to try to in the future, examine and improve people's health engagement around their own goals. So I'm sorry I had to go so quickly through there, but thank you for your attention. So questions? Alex.
Tell us about the synchronicity.
Okay, let's go.
Repeat the question, please.
Oh, yes. Alex said, tell us about the synchronicity. Basically, what you saw from these charts is that there was a lot of individual differences between people on how their goals tended to go up at the same time or down at the same time. And what we found was that, okay, so here's examples of weak and strong correlations, but here's like the regressions. And basically, the short answer is that it does promote goal accomplishment. So the blue is the health goal accomplishment, and the red is the social goal accomplishment. And so people who are able to architect their goals so that they can make good progress on both of them seem to, by the end of the study, make more progress. Yeah. Okay. Jill.
Where did you find any gender differences in these categories? I think you might.
That's a really good question. Since we had so few men in the study, we did covary age and gender from all the analyses, but I don't really feel like we could say very much about the men with only 12. But that's a really good thing that we definitely need to look at.
What would you guess you'd find?
Well, in terms of health, I would think that men, obviously their social networks, I think, are much more based around their particularly in later life, I think, around their family, maybe not tending to have quite as many friends. I think, however, the friends that they do have, they share activities with. So I think that I think women would be more pulled off by, here's my actual prediction, women would be more pulled off by the family not feeling not comfortable with, whereas men may be more with the friends. What would you think?
Well, actually, I don't think it might be different. That's one place where I would expect them to be actually fairly similar, at least in later life, but I would think that the men would be very affected by being pulled off by their friends. So if they were pulled off all of you by family, I would think more. I would think women might get pulled off by both. But I'm totally wrong.
Good question. Melissa?
I'm wondering if you have any plans to have some cross-linkages between the two components that you presented separately today, and will we be looking at the network in the context of these traits?
Yes, yes.
Repeat the question, please.
Oh, yes. So Melissa asked a good question about, okay, to what extent are traits perhaps playing into how these are the other things that you were talking about?
Your social relationships.
The social relationships.
Family, are people with certain traits more likely to have friend focus or family focus?
Yeah,
Or,
yeah.
Does that play out in goal pursuit?
Yes, it plays out for sure, but I don't have those data with me right now. Yeah.
Well, we're right on time then.
Great.
Time for a break. We're going to convene here in 10 minutes.
Welcome back from your short break. It seems that maybe our break time was a little short. I'm loving the energy and the social networking that's taking place, and we would love to see that continue out into our reception and poster session after the symposium. But I have the true pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Alex Zatra, who is joining us today from Arizona State University, where he is the Foundation Professor of Clinical Psychology. And Alex directs a large and interdisciplinary group that studies resilience across the lifespan, among other duties and activities at ASU. And some of his most recent work is focused on social intelligence. And if that's not a familiar term, let me be the first to tell you that social intelligence, according to his website, not my ideas, too bad, is a framework for understanding and relating to one another that transforms us from isolated individuals to socially connected and aware people. In his most recent projects on social intelligence, he's using interesting, creative uses of games and gaming. And it turns out that relying on games is reminiscent of some of his early work a few years ago when he did his senior thesis at Antioch College. And while there, as I've heard, he also was engaged in some other interesting activities, including an unsuccessful run for Congress. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Alex and following this work for many years, and I'm so very pleased that he's here with us today to share his work. And please join me in welcoming Alex Zatra.